Right, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are delighted to welcome Professor Richard Sandell and Dr. Cesare Cuzzola from the Queer Heritage and Collections Network. Richard Sandell is a Professor of Museum Studies and the co-director of the Research Centre for Museum and Galleries. Cesare is a Research Associate at the Research Centre and the Project Coordinator for the Queer Heritage Network. As part of the School of Museum Studies at the university, this research group carries out research that stimulates new thinking and creative practice, enabling cultural organisations to become more ambitious and impactful in nurturing more equitable and inclusive societies. And the Queer Heritage Network itself was founded in 2020 with the aim of better understanding the need and potential for queer heritage interpretation and research and offering peer support to practitioners interested in LGBTQ+ programming. So I'm going to hand it straight over to you two because I'm looking forward to this.
Thank you so much. Nice to see you, everybody. So yes, I'm Cesare from RCMG, and
hi, thanks for having us. I'm Richard, also from RCMG. So we'll get going. We're going to say some opening remarks about sort of queer heritage, LGBTQ+ heritage to begin. We're going to share a couple of our action research projects out of the Research Centre that support or take forward sort of innovation in that area, and then we're going to tell you a bit about how that relates to the QHCN, the Queer Heritage and Collections Network. You've heard a little bit about the Research Centre. We think of ourselves as a little bit different to lots of other research centres, so we say that we research with, not on, cultural organisations. So all of our projects are collaborative. They always involve converting some of our cultural practitioners that work in these organisations to be kind of co-opting them to be part of the research team. So everything is collaborative. And we, as we've said here, the research is rooted in an ethics of anti-ableism, anti-racism. So we look at the capacity for heritage and culture to be advancing rights, respect, dignity across a range of different themes. Just to give you a little flavour, this was at Cork Abbey, and it's a project called Humankind, and it was a project to look at the role that culture can play in tackling social isolation and loneliness. That was 2019, I think. This is Deaf Men Dancing. It was a project working with 7 medical museums to reconfigure their problematic representation of physical and mental differences, disabled lives. And this is from the Wellcome Collection, the museum opposite Euston Station in London, and we were commissioned to work collaboratively to redevelop a permanent gallery called Being Human, again around the theme of disability. So that's just a little bit about RCMG. We had to put in something a bit sort of archaeological into because of the invitation, and the newspapers gave us the gift is this 3 days ago, I think, isn't it? And so we just added this slide in this morning to point to the fact that across heritage, across museums, there's more interest in revealing connections to do with gender diversity, sexual diversity, queer and LGBTQ lives than ever before, both in the UK and globally. So we see a growing literature, a growing number of projects that seek to reveal these connections. So huge interest, but also really uneven take-up of that. So it's a bit of a curious combination, because if an alien sort of landed in the UK, went around every museum, they could be forgiven for thinking there are no queer lives or queer stories. They're very, very rare and few in terms of what appears, but through temporary interventions, through a growing body of projects, there is a growing professional interest in this. So English Heritage, they've done, so I think it's for LGBT History Month, probably revealed connections to do with same-sex love and desire and gender diversity across the sites that they look after. They talk about Emperor Hadrian's gay relationships and the the comments below this article in the Telegraph are just total car crash of offensive, woke or other sort of attacks on making those connections visible. So you find yourselves in this curious position, lots of professional interest but uneven application, a lot of public interest. A lot of these interventions are really, really well received, not just by queer people, but generally they are popular, and yet they're also they can appear to be highly controversial. So we're in this very interesting time for LGBTQ or queer heritage. So these are all from the British Museum, and the kind of stand here for, it's a bit unfair really on the British Museum, but as a sort of, in our world of museum studies, an organisation that's typically been less confident in jumping into making contemporary connections and contemporary relevance, more cautious about being seen to be political than many other forms of museum. So they are more risk averse perhaps and epitomise the mainstream. And yet here, this is 2006, a temporary exhibition of Michelangelo drawings, and was possibly the first, or definitely amongst the first, of exhibitions, Michelangelo exhibitions, that very fully discussed Michelangelo's same-sex desires and the impact of that on his artwork. So, blockbuster after blockbuster, completely omitting or silencing that history. And then at this moment, 2006, the British Museum went for it and fully discussed the conflict between his sexuality and his faith as a driving force for his artistic genius. And that really emerged because they started to ask the public, as they were developing exhibitions, what do you know about the subject matter so we can pitch the interpretation right? And lots of people said, well, wasn't he gay? And they went down that path of trying to kind of connect with and engage with people's interests. Then, speaking to the unevenness, quite a sort of big gap here, 2006, this is probably more like 2011-12, a trail that you had to pick up. It's a leaflet. It was produced by a group outside the British Museum who revealed connections between LGBT lives across the collections of the world collections of the British Museum, and you could follow a trail on this leaflet. And then fast forward again, these two relate to a step change in activity across the sector, which was 2017. They did a temporary exhibition here, Desire, Love, Identity, and a sort of trail as well throughout the museum. And I'll say a bit, next slide please, about 2017, because you've got these sort of sporadic and growing interest in this area of work. But 2017 was marking 50 years since the decriminalisation of same-sex acts between men in England and Wales. So a landmark sort of gay rights legislation. And during the lead up to 2017, cultural organisations were programming, saying, what are you going to do? Tate Galleries announced they were doing a major blockbuster exhibition, Queer British Art. These are pin badges from the British Museum. So they said, we're going to do our first foray into an exhibition around LGBT lives. And so the year before this, 2016, next slide please, we were approached in the Research Centre by the National Trust, who at that time were saying, we want to start not just thinking about queer heritage, but more generally step into public conversations, use heritage to engage people around contemporary issues and relevance. And they were saying, we're not fully sure how to do that. They wanted a research partner. We signed up and we worked at pace to develop a national public programme. So in January of that year, this went through however many million households in Britain. Apparently it's the most read magazine in Britain, which is because it has at that time over 5.5 million members all get the magazine, and more people than, so families read it, and it goes around doctor surgeries and things. So supposedly a really big circulation. This magazine appeared featuring this brilliant cover image of one of the stories that appeared in a national public programme, and we worked with 12 of their properties to research and publicly present queer histories across their sites. At the same time, they also decided to march in 17 UK Gay Pride events. This one was London, but I found myself in the very first one, which was in February 2017 in Exeter, and found myself carrying some of these banners, helping them out because we were doing this project, marching through the very busy city centre of Exeter in the southwest, and finding myself lip reading as we moved through the crowds, because families were waving their membership cards, but also going, oh my God, it's the National Trust. Oh my God, it's the National Trust, because they're very surprised to see an organisation like that in an event like this. And that was a bit of a foreshadowing for what was to come. We were on the front page of every newspaper for a period of about 10 days, which was quite, so as more and more elements of this controversy unfolded, I think this might have been the start, which was 6 volunteers reportedly saying they were told they had to wear rainbow lanyards, like many of you have got on, because they're really quite every day, but they went to the press about that. And then later on, this one, which was, we were accused of outing the person who gave a property called Felbrigg Hall to the National Trust. We didn't out him, but it was reported that we had, and so the controversy unfolded, and really helps us understand this unevenness, because you see this great momentum, even the British Museum, even the National Trust jumping into that work. At the same time, the capacity to be a real lightning rod, to be really controversial, that of course leads to a backpedaling, a greater caution and self-censorship, not just in those organisations, but across the sector, because nobody wants to be on the front page of the newspapers and attacked in that way. So, am I doing this one? Yes, okay. We are now going to jump in. So that's just a little bit of background, really, and trails why we are a founding member of the Queer Heritage and Collections Network. But before we get to the network, we're going to tell you a little bit about 2 very recent and ongoing projects that we have initiated in the Research Centre, and they show really different strategies for intervening in this complex and quite volatile and quite challenging environment, if you like. So this one is Permissible Beauty is public facing. It draws on a whole series of strategies developed out of collaborative research that are really attempting to do new work, but take audiences with us on a big journey. This one deals with another complex element of this area, particularly around trans inclusion, gender, which you only have to open your phone or a newspaper every day at the minute. It's become so weaponized. So whereas this was very public facing, this is a project we did to develop very clear confidence building guidance for the sector on how to navigate this seemingly horrendous sort of context. Okay, I'm going to grab my notes. And Cesare, just interrupt if I miss something. So this is our collaborator, David McCalman at Hampton Court Palace, and the project Permissible Beauty began back in 2019. David had an idea. He wanted to respond to what he saw as an absence of Black queer visibility in Britain, in the public realm. So he would say, when we think Black and queer from a British perspective, we always look across to the USA. We think Paris is Burning, Pose, RuPaul's Drag Race. There isn't the same attention or space for Black queer perspectives in the UK. He would be critical of histories of Black British contributions, which have tended to overlook a queer perspective as well. And so he wanted to develop a project which addressed that absence. And at the same time, he was very interested in the fact that the sector, the heritage sector, was reporting a problem, an inability to appeal to more diverse audiences. So our project involved the three big heritage organisations in the UK that really tell the story of Britain, because we wanted to re-narrate the story of Britain in a more inclusive way, which would be fit for the 21st century. So we work with historic royal palaces, English heritage, the National Trust, particularly these properties, Hampton Court, Kenwood and Petworth, because they all hold collections of 17th century paintings of women known as the Beauties, which marked out ideals of beauty in the 17th century and which we argue still reverberate today. So we'll have the Hampton Court Beauties, the Suffolk collection, which has some of the same artists and sitters there at Kenwood House, and the Petworth Beauties as well here at Petworth. So these were the aims of the project, about what we wanted to do from the research centre perspective. We wanted to widen the invitation to community groups, in this case Black and queer collaborators. By that we mean that heritage organisations are very poor at this. They tend to reach out, for example, to Black communities and say, come in and look at the tiny fragments of our collections that speak directly or explicitly to Black lives. So there's quite a narrow, quite limiting conditions that are set on that invitation. And what we wanted to do was widen that and invite Black and queer collaborators to come in and look at portraits of white women from the 17th century, the kind of core, if you like, core popular collections that are at the heart of some of these properties, and not set limiting conditions on that. We wanted to place Black and queer perspectives at the heart of a process of heritage making, exhibition making, narrating the national story. All of the organisations, they're great, the ones that we work with, but they do have these conventions which can limit opportunities for engaging wider audiences. We wanted to embed and test these anti-racist, anti-ableist, queer and trans-inclusive approaches to heritage making. So we put a whole set of ethical principles in place to help us tell really vivid and engaging stories in ways that wouldn't do harm, that wouldn't exclude, and so on. And then this bit's really important to a lot of the projects we do in the research centre. We set ourselves quite a particular challenge to develop permissible beauty in a way that would be affirming for people who have been left out of the national story. In this case, so to attract, appeal to and affirm Black and queer visitors who very often feel excluded, but in the very same project to also fully engage, move and take existing visitors on a journey with that. So it's not for one group and not for the other, it's for everyone, enriching for everyone and affirming for people who've been left out. Okay. So over a period of 3 years, we shaped a short film called Permissible Beauty and an exhibition. And this is, Cesare and I were here during, in between lockdowns, is that right?
Mm-hmm, I think so, yeah.
And so we're at Hampton Court, taking over the Christopher Wren Design Cartoon Gallery and these courtyards to film and do the research which we wanted to do for the project. It's quite a surreal experience in lots of ways. These, in terms of those were the aims of the project. In terms of the public engagement, we asked visitors, we posed these questions at the start of the exhibition: whose lives are celebrated in our national story, who's overlooked, why some forms of beauty more permissible, more highly valued than others, we're using these portraits to remember the beauties, and how might we start a new chapter of British beauty. And to do this, next slide please, we did a lot of research around the collections. These are part of the Royal Collection, the Windsor Beauties. They've been on display at Hampton Court for many, many years. They depict 10 women who were prominent members of the royal court in the reign of Charles II, including his principal mistress, Barbara Villiers here. Everyone wanted to look like Barbara Villiers. She was the sort of definition of beauty at that time. These portraits were, and the other beauties at the other sites, were brought into conversation with contemporary portraits which we created in both photographic portraits but also portraits in music and in poetry that are all captured in the film through interviews that we did with 6 contemporary Black queer sitters who each brought their own stories to this project. We're going to just show you a walk through the exhibition. This is where the Windsor Beauties are currently displayed, always displayed. We put new interpretation there, and then in this space we showed a short extract of the film. And at this point, you turn to go into the cartoon gallery in a moment, and you'll see that the content and theme and our interpretation became steadily more queer. We had projections on the paneling for interview extracts from our interviews. We created contemporary portraits. These were called the skin and soul portraits, so no makeup, no costume, no just the skin and soul, to kind of give people intimate encounters and learn more about our 6 contemporary Black queer lives. And then in a minute, you'll see the final part of the installation is a huge 3-screen installation in which we blend the historic beauties and the contemporary beauties to try and open up a new chapter of British beauty, to draw connections between this long history of upholding the beauties at Hampton Court, but pluralise, widen that, enable us to make connections and offer up what we said was a new chapter of British beauty. So you can see details from the paintings which draw some of the conventions of beauty making together in order to invite people to see a kind of wider recognition of different kinds of lives in these heritage institutions. And then you exit back out through. The film itself has been in international film festivals, which was a new experience for us. So we had to enter that into competitions, and it's still going around various, I think it's in Poland again this month. Yeah. But it's also in the Cult of Beauty until the end of April. If you're in London, go and see the Cult of Beauty at the Wellcome Collection. It has its own room, which we are thrilled about. It's huge sort of screen, the size of that wall. And it's the culmination, the finale of their big blockbuster exhibition, The Cult of Beauty. And Cesare is going to tell us a little bit about audiences and what they made of it.
Mm-hmm. So as Richard introduced, Permissible Beauty was a big project with a lot of outputs. You've seen snippets of the film, the short film, the portraits themselves, which were professionally made by one of the project collaborators. And then obviously the exhibition was another big output. And for the exhibition itself, we conducted semi-structured interviews with audiences. And these were sort of the 3 strands of findings that we could identify. First one being emotional engagement. So sort of emotional responses to the space, to the topic, strong feelings linked to personal experience. So sort of the exhibition resonating with audiences. And examples of responses were included sort of being touched by the topic and the representation, especially representation of Black skin and Black sitters within Hampton Court Palace, which was sort of viewed as a very white, very privileged space. And the exhibition being one of the reasons to come specifically to Hampton Court Palace, a lot of first-time visitors. Second strand, conversations about contemporary issues. So moving beyond emotional responses, many visitors were prompted to share experiences or thoughts about things happening beyond museums, so beyond heritage, things that are happening outside in society. Things including culture wars. So even though the exhibition didn't directly address culture wars or sort of news items or things that were hot topics while it was on show, visitors were prompted to talk about it in our interviews and sort of started thinking more profoundly about those topics. Things like the Colston statue came up, and the whole idea of a national story and what story we're telling through our heritage institutions. And then finally, increased awareness, understanding, and advocacy for change. So in terms of increased awareness and understanding, again, increased comprehension of cultural, social, and political issues. Again, these might have been mentioned by some of our sitters in the interviews or videos that were in the exhibition, but the exhibition didn't directly tackle these topics. So we had discussion with visitors about belonging. What does it mean to belong? What does it mean to have a national story? And when it comes to advocacy for change, a lot of people were prompted to call for change, especially in terms of heritage. We had people saying more public institutions should do this. That's what public funding is for. It's time for change, and there's a need for representation. So I think it's what we would expect from an exhibition like this in a space like Hampton Court Palace, but it really, to me, spoke about sort of the role of public institutions in bringing awareness and fostering advocacy without sort of getting embroiled in cultural wars necessarily. And I think that brings us nicely to our second sort of example, which is trans-inclusive culture. Now this, like Richard was saying, is a sort of sector-facing piece of guidance that we decided to create. Unlike other projects made by our CMG, this was a project we sort of started. It was our initiative. And we worked with collaborators, but we didn't want to spotlight a specific museum. We just wanted to produce a piece of guidance that is sector-facing and that museum professionals can use practically. It's freely downloadable from our website. This is the cover, and I'll just go through some of the features of the project, but we worked very quickly to put this together, and we produced initially a pre-launch survey to gauge interest within the sector for this topic to be tackled, or whether a guidance like this was needed. We received over 130 responses from sector professionals, people that work with museums, and that informed what we wrote and what we included in the guidance. And then after the launch, we set up the sort of digital version of the guidance with a brief survey. So all our outputs are available online for free. This one in particular has a little survey that pops up whenever you try to access it or download it. And as of December 2023, we received it was downloaded 6,400 times, and we got over 1,000 responses in that little survey, which is very quick, but it tells us how the guidance is being used. And we found that over 73% had already used or have shared the guidance with their teams. And we also conducted workshops with several institutions or our conferences to sort of present the guidance and also give ad hoc advice to specific teams. And we found increased levels of confidence when it comes to trans inclusion and promoting and fostering trans inclusion within their institution. We're gonna try and play a short video. There we go.
Just with time, so I'll just take that a sec because we've covered quite a bit of this, and we'd love some time for questions. So I'll romp through these slides, and you can take on the QHCN. Yeah. Is that okay? So this is the launch at the Bishopsgate Institute last September. As we were developing most of our projects, like Permissible Beauty, took 3.5 years to develop. This was like 5 months from deciding to doing it to launching it, so we've never worked at that pace. This hit the news 3 months after we announced we were doing that and ran the survey, and it seemed again like every couple of weeks there was a new story about museums getting caught in some of the crossfire around trans inclusion, and the appetite and need for the guidance just grew, really. We basically bring together law and ethics. So we worked with legal scholars and law experts, as well as our own expertise in ethics and inclusion, to sort of do this comprehensive approach to all aspects of trans inclusion, which is embodied in our ethical framework. You saw in the slides, in the film, it's backed by a load of different organisations. We did that purposefully, so not individual museums, but the sector leading support organisations, to show this isn't a sort of personal project. It's not gender ideology as it's so often depicted in the news. It's been the law for 13 years to all public sector bodies in Britain should be advancing trans inclusion. We wanted to signal that through, and we managed to get these organisations to sign up at very short notice, which was great. We made a decision not to respond to the sensational and inflammatory news coverage which we knew would come. We turned down an invitation to go from Jacob Rees-Mogg to go on GB News, for example. And yet we knew some of this would come and planned for that and worked with our comms colleagues to prepare for that. And sure enough, a much more sort of positive story emerged, and Cesare has talked about how much that's already been taken up by the sector. So we're going to finish with some remarks about the QHCN, and then hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so this comes as a sort of culmination, I guess, in this presentation of this strand of work for our CMG. We have been part of the Queer Heritage and Collections Network since its founding in 2020, but just last year we put in an application to Arts Council England for more funding. And we got it. So we are currently leading on the Queer Heritage and Collections Network, which I have a short description for here. Its aim is to better understand the need and potential for queer heritage and interpretation and research, and offer peer support to practitioners interested in LGBTQ+ programming. These are the 5 founding partners of the network. A lot of them you have already seen in the presentation we've collaborated with. In terms of what the network does, we have networking events, we run online workshop, training sessions, all hybrid or online, freely available. We have conferences and symposia. We have an annual symposium hosted by one of the founding partners. We also offer funding opportunities and collaborations. Historically, we've funded grassroots organizations, small museums, small projects that might have been sort of temporary interventions in museums, or might have not had the capacity or support to sort of continue the legacy of the project, or it would have disappeared. So we fund publications of small publications of existing projects, or sort of digital legacies. And we offer digital resources through our website. And these are sort of the new ambitions for this next phase of the network that, like I said, was existed before we took over, but since January 2024, we're sort of leading on it. And again, it's about building capacity and confidence around these issues. We want to continue the work of funding creative projects. So we committed to work on at least 6 new creative projects with some of our partners, collaborators, members of the network, which includes organizations and also individuals. Anybody can join. And I guess the new ambition of the network is to build a cohort of national leaders that aim to sort of connect all these glimmers of talent and excellence throughout the nation and internationally. Is the current ambition. Like we were saying in the beginning, the sort of ground is very uneven, but there are glimmers of excellence. So we want to build on that through mentorship, rather than just funding the creative projects, to foster them and nurture our partners and collaborators. So building this cohort and a mentorship program is our newest ambition. And I think we got there.
I hope it takes us full circle from the kind of challenges, how we've been working in that space, and then how we want to sort of support all of that work going forward. But we'd love to hear your thoughts and questions. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you. That was a really interesting talk. I know I enjoyed it. I'm sure the room share the feeling. We've already got one question in the chat from Debbie Frierson. Did you pre-plan the strategy on how to deal with the press, or was this as the situations arose, such as declining interviews with Rees-Mogg, etc.?
It's a good question. I have started saying that I've never spent so long in comms preparatory meetings over the last maybe 3 years as we have over the previous 30. So we have had other projects, but we are definitely in unprecedented times so our comms team here in the university know of mainstream journalists who don't just respond to a press release, they're actively combing the University of Leicester's web pages for stories that will stoke some of this division and polarizing. And so we did really prepare with some pre-prepared anticipated Q&As and some statements that we wanted the university to shoulder and not particularly, especially for the trans collaborators, that they should not have to be picked off. So their names are in it, and we discussed all of that, but it was under the banner of the University of Leicester, and that was very carefully prepared.
And I'm wondering as well about the criticism of the guidance and how we responded to that. There is a temptation to sort of respond right away to criticisms or to debunk some of the statements that are made about the guidance, but instead we decided to wait and release our own statement, in part addressing some of those criticisms, but also restating our position on the guidance and how it's legally sound, and also it's guidance. It's not a piece of legal advice. So I think that was a good strategy.
Do we have any questions in the room? Ooh, hello. Yes, I can loop you in.
Hello, is that okay? Outside of going to London or Poland, how can we see this video?
We're excited to be able to release it online, free to access very, very soon. We had to agree, we wanted to agree, but we had to agree with Wellcome Collection that we would delay the free online posting until the exhibition finishes at the end of April, and then it'll be on our website. But if you want to see it before and you email, we could probably find a private viewing link for that, but it will be free to access. And it's about 23 minutes long. Mm-hmm. And we're really proud of it. It's a really different kind of outcome for us. It's very beautiful in many, many ways. So yeah, we'll get that to you.
Sort of in the same vein as Amy's question, have there been projects in the past, or are there projects in the works that will involve film in terms of collaborating with institutions like BFI or the National Lottery Fund and making queer art that way?
I didn't quite catch the question. Did you say about...
Have you had projects in the past, or are you planning projects that are more to do with film and maybe more like feature?
Feature-length films, it sounds so glamorous, we love it. We have started to think more about film, and I think partly that was a COVID thing, because our sort of normal playground of museums and heritage sites was closed and we were carrying on. But probably more fundamentally, it's an opportunity for heritage to be harnessed to a much wider audience, because it's full-blown heritage in that film, the collections, the settings and so on, and yet we didn't want it to be, we know that only certain people visit museums, and we wanted to still use heritage but unleash it more widely into the social and political world. So we did a project called Everywhere and Nowhere, the National Trust, that is 20 minutes long, that is already free to access on our website, and always was, and was the first time that the National Trust told stories of disability. And so we have 10 objects, really powerful, engaging stories, and they are now being fed into the 10 National Trust properties that host them. But actually the front door to the whole project was a free to access on social media, download straight away film, because we wanted to stimulate a national conversation about disability. And it went viral fairly early on because one of our stories was Henry VIII, and it got picked up by the same journalist saying, how dare you say Henry VIII was disabled, and people saying there's lots of books about him being disabled. What you know, so I think film as a more accessible and powerful sort of medium is something we want to do more and think through more. As for feature films, we'll get onto it. Watch this space.
Any other questions in the room? I have one then. So I was just thinking, when you were showing, I think it was the beauties work that you were doing, saying you were doing that between lockdowns, and just thinking about how these heritage spaces, or at least the typical ones, it's weird to see them empty. So I guess with the context of lockdowns, did that change your approaches or thinking at all to the work you were doing?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. It was, I guess the coincidence of there were a lot of coincidences going on with Permissible Beauty, because the exhibition wasn't originally planned. It just happened that there was a slot in the programming that we could fit, and it's sort of, because of COVID, a lot of the project and the way we thought about the project changed. In terms of sort of who visits and how do you ensure sort of like, how do you deal with space and the audience that goes? I think that was a conversation that we had throughout, and so to enter Hampton Court Palace, it's you have to pay for a ticket, and that includes Permissible Beauty. So we had to think a little bit laterally about that, and how do you ensure that it's not the same audience visiting all the time. And we were I think the team at Hampton Court really helped with this, thinking about their community sort of participants and how they could have free tickets pretty liberally going to them. I don't know if you can think of other ways in which, it's sort of a question about accessibility, I guess, of the space as well.
Yeah, the whole sort of COVID and lockdown and access to those spaces was, we would turn up as Bridgerton were leaving, and that Bridgerton would obviously pay a lot of money for those spaces, whereas this is a project that Historic Royal Palace is bought into. So they gave us and committed to access to spaces, collections and expertise to sort of make what we did. And it's kind of weird seeing those places during, I mean, and obviously a huge privilege. It was quite sunny days, and we got to take over the whole spaces and have so much more input from the Palace's team than when we first did the funding bid. We were a few months into lockdown. Heritage organisations were shedding staff and dealing with major financial problems. So I think we committed them to something like 5 days of access to something, and they gave 500 really in the end, because the project started to really chime with their ambitions to be more inclusive and more active in contemporary conversations.
That's really interesting, thank you. Any final questions in the room? Yes.
Thanks. I was quite interested that pamphlet that I think you said it was like 2016-17 to do with the British Museum, where it wasn't actually produced by the museum itself. So it's sort of people coming in and reassessing the heritage themselves and saying, actually, there's these connections that the museum's currently not taking advantage of. And I was wondering, in terms of your collaborations, is it always that the museums themselves who approach you, or do you have like particular holdings that that there's potential here for a really strong queer-facing exhibition? That you reach out to the museums? I was kind of curious about how that process works.
Yeah, we consider ourselves really lucky with the networks that we have and the opportunities that we get. I think we thought of the split, but possibly like half our projects are self-initiated. So Permissible Beauty, we got the money, we approached the partners with the ideas, we said, will you collaborate with us? And then the other half are what the university thinks of as commissioned research. So we're currently, the research is paid for by Museum of London, National Portrait Gallery, and others that we're working in. So we get to, that it's always collaborative, but it's sometimes initiated by us where we see the gap in knowledge and understanding, and we approach it in quite a sort of research-led way. But the organisations that come to us say, we've got a problem with something, we need help, and we think a collaborative research project will help us achieve that. So can we work together? So we get, lots of opportunities that way, and we turn some things down if they're not right. We're such a tiny team, and we want to have a real positive impact, and we know it's enriching, but it's also quite frustrating working with, we often work with the big organisations, you know, British Museum, National Trust, Historic Royal Palaces, and they're amazing people and teams, but they're also challenging when we're trying to work at the leading edge of a field that is always pushing some boundaries. And we're quite interested in this idea. I keep going on about this sort of reframing the complaint. So like these projects generate negative, lots of positive, but they do generate negative responses. People, you've seen some of the headlines, but the organisations know that if they want to enter some of these contemporary debates, that means living with, preparing for complaints. And so not always the people-pleasing stuff that most of us like and heritage organisations really like, but to sort of recognise as the sector as a whole turns to being more active in what can be quite a polarising space. They need to sort of rethink what success looks like, because sometimes generating some negative responses is part of the process of change which we're trying to create. Does that make sense?
Any final questions in the room?
Thank you, Emma. Following on the last question, actually, I was wondering if you know a institution I'm very lucky to collaborate with. It's called the Museum of Broken Relationships in Zagreb. Okay, you do. They own hundreds of thousands of objects donated by the public, many of which are actually coming from people who do not see themselves represented in national histories worldwide, many of which are, of course, from trans people or homosexual, gay, and disabled. And they are organizing small projects worldwide where they circulate certain objects connected to specific topics. And I wondered if for you working with institutions small institutions like this, that collect stories coming from the public directly and returning them to the public can be interesting in any way?
I saw you nodding, Nicole. Do you know that museum as well?
Vaguely, yes.
I think I've just seen a presentation on it at a conference. It's really compelling, really amazing sort of human stories. And so we're quite interested, even as we work with these mainstream, in tapping into some of these more innovative grassroots and sort of community-driven projects, because it's often where the innovation really lies. So, for example, in trans-inclusive culture, one of our main contributors is from the Museum of Transology, which is the first and the world's largest collection of objects donated by trans people. And there are growing numbers of trans archives and grassroots projects. Often they grow up because of the failings of the mainstream to do the work. So they're a response to that. And then sometimes we see the mainstream attempt to kind of co-opt or sort of partner with and so on. So there's this constant dynamic between grassroots heritage organisations and the more of the mainstream. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's fantastic if you're going to do some stuff. Those organisations can do stuff, I think, that many others can't. We just quite like sometimes combining, because the mainstream obviously have this big space in the public realm. You know, they're either well visited or they're high profile. I often say things like the fact that the British Museum discussed Michelangelo's sexuality, it's not only that, the impact is not only on the people that visited and saw that, because it's in the news, it's in reviews, it gets written about, and people talk and tell their friends about it. So the sort of power of being inclusive in that sense leaks out beyond the exhibition and the visitors in all sorts of different ways.
I think we're to time now. So as I get my steps in, did you want to mention the leaflets you've got for people?
Yes. We've got leaflets for the Queer Heritage and Collections Network with this QR code, but feel free to come and grab one if you like.
So all that's left for us to say is thank you again. If anyone wants to continue the fun conversations, we are going to the Old Horse up the road, so please do join us. But can we have a final round of applause for our two speakers?
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, that was really great.